So far on this channel, I've covered up a number of really famous fraud cases that you can actually go and have a look at in the news. I mean, you can go Google these things and you can actually find out about them. Today, I want to turn that around and I want to talk about a fraud case that I worked on that you won't be able to find in the news. So let me set the scene. First of all, I didn't look like this. So let's change that. So a couple of years ago, I was invited up to one of the state government departments here in Australia. Not going to mention the name or the state, but I was invited to a meeting up in the state government department, and I went up to their office in the government part of town, and I was shown into a very smart looking office and then into a very smart looking boardroom where there was a whole bunch of very professional and very serious people sitting around a table. But I knew from the second I walked in that something was very wrong. So I kick off the meeting and I introduce myself, and I have a fairly standard way of doing this. I say, hi, my name's Andrew, I'm an expert in fraud management. I give some of my experience and I say I'm here to help. And then I go around the meeting and I get everyone to introduce themselves. And two things I noticed. First of all, these are the top dogs from the department. I mean, we're talking CEO, CFO, two CPOs, a whole bunch of executives, and strangely a partner from an accounting firm. But there's also another thing I noticed, and that's that they're being really short with their answers. Like, it's first name, title, move on. But look, hey, that's cool. Been there, done that, seen it all before. And when I get a meeting like this, I generally tend to start with some open-ended questions. Like, hey, look, what are you concerned about? How are you paying your suppliers at the moment? Where do you think the weaknesses in your system might be? And these are typical questions that you're taught as part of a consulting training to get people to open up. So the idea is you ask them an open-ended question, they give you an answer, and then you listen to the details and you follow up on that. And you usually get people to actually open up. You know, they'll give you more and more information. But in this case, I'm getting nothing. Seriously, I'm getting like one-word answers from these guys, maybe two at the most. And at the moment, all they're doing is confirming my suspicions that something is wrong. Now, look, this is not great, but it's not super unusual. I mean, some people just take a while to open up. Some people don't want someone to go all salesy or consultancy on them. So look, I do a quick check that I'm dressed, do a quick check that there's nothing inappropriate on the slides, and then I kind of like go, oh, look, this meeting is a bit awkward, but there's one last strategy I use, and that's I tell a story. So I start telling them a story about a professor at a very prestigious university. I do the background on the people that are involved. I paint a picture about the institution, about the way they work, what's important to them. And I set up the story, and eventually I get to the point where I say, this very well-educated and brilliant professor is caught charging haircuts on their corporate card. At this point, without thinking, the CFO blurts out, that's nothing, we had someone buy a car. And you could have heard a pin drop. And despite all the death stares in the room, no one said a thing. So they took a corporate breath, realised that disaster hadn't fallen on them, and they actually shared their story with me. They had an employee who was charged of setting up social housing. You know, these were houses that were for people that were disabled, disadvantaged in the community. There might have been elderly people or even young people. So the department itself would buy or rent a house, and then they would go to local shops and they would buy furniture and put it in the house. These things were there for a genuine need, and it was way cheaper than putting them in temporary accommodation like a hotel or having them stay in hospital. So when setting up these houses, speed was often a concern because usually the people were homeless in some sort of way. So the staff were given corporate cards to purchase these items. Now, this is for a good cause and it's a good solution, no question about that. But one of the problems with speed is often it comes at the casualty of proper spend oversight. And this was the case in this example. The employee in question had bought a car. They had simply bought a car. They put it on a $3,000 a month payment plan, and then every month they put it in their expense reports. One month they said it was a sofa, the next month a bed, the next month a chair. And this is a classic way of getting questionable items approved on your expense report. If your expense report is 30 to 40 line items long, who's actually going to go through all of those receipts? Unless your boss isn't, I don't know, an anally retentive accountant like myself, they're probably not going to do that. So essentially, if you want to get your illegitimate receipt approved, put it about 2/3 of the way down your expense report, bury it in the details, and almost no one is going to pick that up unless your company has an AI or anal audit person looking at your expense report, which most people don't. So how were they caught? Well, this is why that Big Four partner was in the room. So the Big Four have been doing their annual financial audit of the company, and part of that audit, they randomly selected 10 out of 10,000 expenses, and they made sure the receipts matched to expense. It's just part of what they do as the audit. Now, they just happened to pick the one receipt that was for the car. So they had about a 1 in 10,000 chance of finding this. They noticed that the vendor on the receipt didn't match the vendor on the invoice, and the fraud was found. After the story came out, they relaxed a little bit. And I asked them why they were reluctant to tell me this story. And they admitted it was because they were embarrassed. They didn't want to admit this happened on their watch. They didn't want to admit they had no way of telling whether it was a one-off or something that had happened over and over again. They felt ashamed that they lacked an effective method for preventing fraud and a robust internal program for identifying weaknesses in their system. And in my experience, this is certainly not unusual. Fraud is embarrassing for a lot of companies. And there are a lot of companies out there that would prefer just simply not to know about it. A kind of weird, keep your head in the sand, don't ask, don't tell sort of mentality. And I know fraud is embarrassing. No one wants to admit that they're not doing everything they can to prevent fraud. No one wants to admit they're wrong, and no one wants to admit that it's happening on their watch. But the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners estimates that up to 5% of your revenue could be walking out the door due to fraud. In the end, I explained to these guys, fraud is something that is actually happening in most companies. It might be someone taking stationery home for kids at the start of the school year. It might be catching a taxi home when you're not in fact working, you've been out drinking, or it might be a $50 million scheme. You just don't know. It is probably happening in most companies. The difference is what you choose to do about it. But the good news is that you are already in possession of the most effective prevention tool for fraud, and it's not going to cost you anything, not one single cent. I'm Andrew Chapman. I specialise in managing costs and preventing fraud, and I can help you change from an ignore it and it might go away sort of policy to an effective fraud prevention policy without pissing off your staff. If you or your company needs help, please reach out. Till next time.